principles of today, which is that there's no aligning ourselves with nationalist, imperialist warfare and voting in favor of military budgets to benefit no one but the rich if we claim to be about the business of liberating ourselves and our fellow working class people. But back to Lenin. He published essays and political pamphlets that called for the establishment of a true socialist state. He fearlessly debated petty bourgeois politicians that misinformed the masses while organizing the Soviets to prepare for an armed takeover of the state. He remained true to the tenets of Marxism, stating clearly that a Marxist, quote, must not abandon the ground of careful analysis of class relations. Another lesson in there for us. The bourgeoisie maintains itself in power not only by force, but also by virtue of the lack of class consciousness and organization, the routinism and downtrodden state of the masses. Again, lesson in this for us, working class people of today. We remain oppressed not only because of daily killings of black and brown folks by the police and displacement from housing crises and gentrification and environmental racism and fiascos like Mossville, Gordon Plaza, St. James Parish, Norca, Cancer Alley, and that's just Louisiana. But because amidst every level of oppression that we experience at the hands of the rich ruling class, we fail to connect the dots to class consciousness and organize in a way that links the struggles of working class black and brown folks and working class white folks in Cancer Alley to indigenous folks fighting the Bayou Pipeline, all the way up to the Dakota Access Pipeline, at the top of the Mississippi, to the Flint water crisis next door, to the school privatization happening only a few towns over in Detroit that looks just like the privatization in Chicago, that looks just like what's happening in Oakland, in Jacksonville, been happening in New Orleans for the past decade. Now all impoverished, food desert-laden neighborhoods where it's happening at, they create an environment conducive to working class folks doing what they gotta do, getting it how they live, as we say in New Orleans, only to be met with police violence as an imperialist band-aid atop the bloodletting of primarily poor black and brown bodies. Amidst similar circumstances over a year ago, Lenin reminded us that the proletariat party, quote, strives to create as large a state as possible because this is the advantage of the working people. There's more of us than there are them, as Big E says all the time. It strives to draw nations closer together and bring about their further fusion, but it desires to achieve this aim not by violence, but exclusively through a free fraternal union of the workers and the working people of all nations, which is to say, organize, organize, organize. Ideally, it's supposed to be what's going to get it, but we know that the state ain't about to give it over to us for free or without violence. That said, when the bourgeoisie wouldn't get out of the way and violence became necessary, Lenin and the Bolsheviks was about that life too, as we must be. It's also crucial to note that, speaking of nations, the first Soviet government established a Congress of Nationalities that gave representation to all of the minority nations of Russia at the time. In one of his most important essays, the April Thesis, Lenin rolled out a 10-point platform that called for the establishment of the true tenets of socialism. Take note of how these 10 align with some of the very principles of Marxism. Do we have a, you got that? Don't worry about it. All right, look it up, y'all. Get the April Thesis, do what you got to do. We'll try to maybe post some of this stuff. But the ones I want you to pay most attention to are, 1, educate the masses on the fraudulent nature of capitalist war. That's at least one of the driving tenets of what we're doing consistently here. We're not talking about the war right now. We're not talking about militarism tonight, but it's definitely something we've talked about, continue to do. Expose the fraudulence of transitional false leadership. Don't every organizer in this room know about that. We constantly contend with some bourgeois politicians trying to co-opt our work or erase it or create something completely different from what we said in the first place. Transfer state power to the workers. We got a ways to go on that. That's called actually seizing the means of production. Abolish police, army, and bureaucracy and make elected officials' wages equal to the workers. I love that. Yeah, I love all that. That's an eloquent way of saying F the police, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff. Beautiful. Confiscate the land, nationalize the land, return the land to the people. You're going to hear tenets in this that sound resonant and familiar because your favorite's favorite, that's what Lenin is. You know how they be talking about, like, I'm your favorite's favorite? That's what Lenin and Marx is. This is the source. This is the uncut raw. So if you heard Fred Hampton or George Jackson or Huey P. say something that got you in your chest, it's because they was reading Marx and Lenin at the parties, like literally. All right? Consolidate all the banks into one bank and give control to the workers, the Soviet workers' deputies. Kind of stuff that got Gaddafi killed. Taking over your own resources, your money, okay? You don't even have to be a Marxist-Leninist. Just act like one. You're going to get the state on your ass real quick. If you want to know what imperialism looks like, follow like one of these tenets when you go to work on Monday. All right. Finally, with the October Revolution and the ousting of the transitional government for a true socialist government, the Bolshevik Party established true socialism in Russia. Moral of the story. The petty bourgeoisie is to the proletariat as the overseer is to the enslaved person, as the house Negro is to the field Negro, Malcolm. Somebody who also gave several cosigns on socialism. Matter of fact said, I need to drop this in there, if you find a white ally, they're probably a socialist. All right? Why? Because capitalism is the best preservative for all of those other systems of oppression. So somebody that tears away at the economic system might find their own humanity beneath it, God forbid. Y'all don't hear me. I'm about to get a communist church up in here. I know it's you gotta go to one another.
Amen. Communist amen.
What's the communist amen?
Amen.
Amen. A woman? Amen? Okay. Boom.
A women.
A woman. Let's go. Workers of the world. You know, women represent that more than anybody. All right. As the manager is to the wage slave employee, as the middle and upper middle class is far too often to the working class. But with persistent, patient, and thorough planning and organizing rooted in accurate Marxist theory, the proletariat can and will overcome the ruling class. Once theory becomes praxis, once words become action, then revolutionary ideas become reality. For my last example, last case study, we're going to look at an example of what victory looks, well, we just looked at what victory looks like when precise revolutionary theory aligns with persistent application, all right? The next example is an unfortunate example of what happens when a theory is never clearly defined or delineated, much less the actions to follow. Enter the Black Power movement, which I sometimes call the Black Power outage movement, no shade. But the reality is, it never reached its full potential. Disclaimer, before I go into a critique of the great work of my ancestors, I want to first acknowledge the amazingly powerful contributions that they did make, flawed though they may have been, in their efforts to liberate themselves from the long-held chains of slavery as a colonized nation on a foreign land. By extension, I think it's more than fair to acknowledge that if it was difficult for the Bolsheviks to free themselves from colonization and imperialism on their own homeland, it's been that and then some for people who have been kidnapped from our homes and enslaved on a foreign land, only to further be suppressed by capitalism, race-based discrimination, and terrorism thereafter. That said, if we do not learn from the mistakes of our ancestors, we will never achieve the liberation that they gave their lives for. So let's look at it, the Black Power movement. Who was who, what was what we got right, what we went wrong. This is not a comprehensive analysis. I'm not that wise or arrogant to think about to do that in the next 5 minutes, but take what you will. We're going to look at, very specifically, the moment of Black Power, a mantra that emerges in the fall of 1966 on the heels of the Civil Rights Movement. It's introduced by legendary activist Pt.3, who was known at the time as Stokely Carmichael. He led the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. SNCC split off from its parent organization, SCLC, or Southern Christian Leadership Conference, of which Martin Luther King Jr. was president. Due to SCLC's strategies growing increasingly insufficient to address the racially hostile environment of the time, they felt as younger organizers they had to go chart their own path. Young black and working class people nationwide didn't want to sing, "We Overcome" no more. They wanted power and they wanted it now. There's an important lesson here in class consciousness and struggle. Much of the civil rights movement's shortcomings can be traced to this moment where the middle class led movement failed to meet the needs of the more impoverished working class. The mantra Black Power emerged as an expression for the need for exactly that. The only problem was that the movement never collectively decided what power was, never got ideological solidarity and clarity about what they meant when they were saying power. All right? There's a huge price to pay for that, unfortunately. This lack of ideological clarity is the fragile ground that a movement stands or stumbles on, rises or falls on. It ultimately forms a very concrete difference between the proletariat and the petty bourgeoisie, between a Bolshevik and a Menshevik, between revolution and reform, between overthrowing your oppressor and merely replacing him with another that looks just like him. Just as Stokely Carmichael announced Black Power with no certain definition of its meaning, the Black Panthers formed in Oakland with a much more clear-cut definition of what power meant to them. With their 10-point plan, they called for an end to occupation of black communities by the police and the capitalist class. They wanted access to housing, jobs, education, clothing, justice, and with language that directly quoted Lenin and surely shook the rich ruling class to their bones, they demanded peace, land, and bread. The Panthers were the most prominent black organization at the time to take a loud political stance founded in Marxist-Leninist principles of socialism. They called ECHO worldwide and resonated in the minds and hearts of socialist revolutionaries and anti-colonialists worldwide, from Che and Fidel in Cuba, to Mao in China, to Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. And these calls echo in the minds and hearts of revolutionary cries for true and total liberation to this day. Meanwhile, the enemy didn't sleep. The state's response to the Black Power movement was as swift and brutal as a barrage of bullets, as deceptive and cunning as a snake. The U.S. government listed the Panthers as the #1 threat to national security, a true indication of the power of the people when organized to shake the country's foundation at its capitalist core. Meanwhile, the SCLC, SNCC, and CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality, as well as other progressive civil rights organizations, the state chose a different method. They descended on those movements with tricks and treats to lullaby the movement to sleep. And it's been sleeping ever since. In the same fall of '66, the Black Power was announced. The Ford Foundation deployed its own president, George Bundy, to set up meetings in several major cities around the country to meet with prominent civil rights leaders and get to the bottom of what this Black Power thing was really all about. Between the years of 1964 to 1968, there were at least a few hundred rebellions in the U.S., rebellions that they call riots, if you wonder what I'm talking about. Mostly in major cities like Watts, Detroit, Newark, New York, D.C., not to mention the endless resistance in the American South, costing major corporations millions of dollars, with a lot more to lose if it kept going. Some of their major factories were still located in these cities. By meeting with civil rights leaders, they hoped to rain some petty cash on the blazing fires of revolution and lullaby the awakened giant of the black proletariat back to sleep. The black progressives who called for power were mostly members of the black middle class themselves, unequipped to fully articulate the needs and wants of the black proletariat. When addressing what they actually meant by black power, people like Nathan Wright, who was the chairman of the 1967 Black Power Conference, advised black people to, quote, seek executive positions in corporations, superintendencies of schools, and high management positions in banks, stores, investment houses, legal firms, civic and government agencies, and factories. Meanwhile, activists like Carmichael said, quote, black power means sharing of control. Politically, it means the coming together of black people to elect representatives and to force those representatives to speak to their needs. That was it. Jobs and political appointments. That must have brought a smirk to the mouths of the rich ruling class, because it takes us right back to the business and government components of the capitalist machine. So here we are, back in the same track, unwittingly selling ourselves back to the same oppressors that we had just demanded power from, which is perhaps the root of the problem. The fact that we can't, as Audre Lorde once said, free ourselves with, we can't, as she once said, free ourselves from the master's house with the master's tools. Or like Fred Hampton once said, we can't free ourselves with black capitalism, we have to free ourselves with black socialism. Unfortunately, that type of precise analysis of capitalist racist oppression was rarely articulated and even more rarely applied. The rich ruling class successfully co-opted most of the leadership of the civil rights movement with a litany of corporate-sponsored conferences brought to you by Xerox, Clairol, Ford, and other campaigns of industry, and ultimately granted big job opportunities and government positions to the formerly rebellious black middle class, just like they asked for. And the proletariat and lumpen proletariat, or the working class and the unemployed, who often took to the streets of rebellion at the behest of the leadership of the black middle class, they were lulled into submission by their once leaders with low-paying jobs and partnerships with non-profit grant programs that use black youth, for example, for their get-out-the-vote campaigns and research projects and the like. That's a pattern that still plays out to this day. Again, much of this can be traced back to the Ford Foundation, who expanded from their original station in Michigan, where they were founded in 1936, to occupying over 80 countries by the time that they laid siege on the Black Power movement in the 1960s. It should be clearly understood that what they were spearheading was the establishment of the nonprofit industrial complex as a means to pacify revolutionary resistance the world over, as they still do to this day. Our Take 'em Down NOLA comrades know it well, as we watched them descend on the city with $2 million in grant money for alleged social justice campaigns right here in New Orleans, 10% of which went to a nonprofit startup paid to co-opt the Take 'em Down NOLA work to remove real monuments to white supremacy by trumping up a cockamamie art project designed to make paper monuments to past civil rights gains and distract from the present and future work remaining to be done. I digress. I could go on and on. But I'm gonna just close with this last example because it probably bears the most significance for the moment we're in. There's an infamous story about how the feds deployed letters of dissension between the cultural nationalist camp of Ron Karenga, who was the inventor of Kwanzaa. Y'all all heard of Kwanzaa, hopefully. This is very important, you know, in the cultural nationalist philosophy and ethos of Black America. Now, it's huge if you co-opt this guy because it's almost like you put two different sides playing chess against each other and you co-opted one of the kings. Now, this king can go against this other king until we make a catastrophe for the whole chessboard. Welcome to Black America 2019. That's what happened to us. But it starts right here. Letters were disseminated between the two camps. They basically made one camp look like the other was hating on them, boom, boom, boom. It's your original East-West Coast beef on much larger proportions. And they knew that Karenga's organization, United Slaves, thought of cultural nationalism as the route towards revolution and ultimate liberation. For the United Slaves, as long as Black people were able to be more fully represented and speak in our original African tongue, wearing our original African garb, the liberation would have been achieved. On the other hand, the Panthers, with their Marxist-Leninist lens, knew better. They understood the limitations of this strategy. They understood that the state will gladly grant the oppressed the superficial freedoms that the culture does afford, so long as they retain ownership of the means of production. Music, culture, and even religion and education are all elements of the Marxist superstructure that the state can sell right back to you for their profit. Worse yet, once a people can be lulled to sleep with the very necessary comforts of cultural representation, they can begin to forget all the oppression reigning above their heads and boiling beneath their feet. This is the same control mechanism that the original colonizers right here in New Orleans used when they let enslaved Black folks dance to our music and culture on Sundays in Congo Square while binding us in chains every other day of the week. Which is to say, the deceptive devices used in the 60s that ultimately turned the Black Power movement to a Black Power outage are the same tricks the oppressor has been using since slavery. They're the same ones they use to this day, when after 40 years of post-traumatic Black Power outage disorder, after 40 years of infestation of our communities with drugs and violence, coupled with the biggest hike in incarceration rate in the world's history, we get hope dangled in our face in the form of a self-proclaimed capitalist in blackface. Add to that the divisive double talk of the right wing who misrepresented the 44th president as a socialist, we can only wish, when he was just as committed to upholding the state as any president before him, if not more so. And it's on the heels of this massive deception of the working class of all races that we were reduced to voting for a fascist on one end of the racial divide and an imperialist on the other. The state will continue to produce exactly what it's designed to until we smash it and recreate it in the people's image. No corporate-sponsored politician or state-sanctioned reform will ever do that for us. Only a clearly politically informed mass with ideological solidarity and clear plans to take back what's ours. A right to live and breathe clean air, drink free water, and use our labor to provide for the well-being of all humanity, not the limited access of an oppressive few. The right to genuine socialism and freedom from all its imposters.